understanding of the meta-narrative of the evolution of monogamy was in the church as a norm tells a deeper story that is missed if you attempt to misinterpret them to make your modern sexual mores look like they were the mores that were had at the time of various parts of the Bible being written, which hides from you, I think, a deeper and more interesting truth. It is kind of weird that the Bible isn't that explicit about one husband, one wife, but
Yeah.
seems to assume it in the New Testament, where in the Old Testament, it seems to assume that wealthy men have multiple wives.
Yes, yes.
And actually, in Roman cultural norms, it was one wife. Rome definitely represented the core of civilizing force. And I think what we see here is civilization crashing into religion, creating something that is a merger of both of them.
That is not just.
It's law.
Roman law.
Is there some other form of law? You wretched woman.
1,000 apologies.
One, in the form of Christianity, but also in the form of post-Second Temple Judaism. And this is where the views get really spicy.
You must guarantee, of course, to keep your Jews in line.
They will do as I say, or they will suffer the consequences.
Congratulations, then, Herod. You have the full backing of Rome.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be talking with you today. Today, we are going to be talking about an issue that I think just doesn't get a lot of good and honest coverage, which is, what does the Bible actually say about taking multiple wives? And the reason why you're not going to get good coverage of this is Christians generally sweep under the rug that there's a lot of people of the Bible with multiple wives, because now it is normal within modern Christianity to only have one wife. And it's the same with modern Judaism. Modern Judaism is mostly a monogamous religious system. And so they just, the people who are like super pro-Christian or super pro-Jew generally don't dwell on this point too much.
Okay.
So when you go and you're reading about this, it's usually people who want to dunk on the Bible, or who want to dunk on Jews, or who want to dunk on, early whatever, right? And I think because of that, people miss interesting things we can learn about the development of Christianity and Judaism by studying both, one, what are the actual rules laid out in the Bible around this? And two, how and why did they develop and change over time?
Okay. I'm excited for this.
Any thoughts?
I'm kind of afraid of what we're going to learn. Is it more in the end biblical to just not well, God, yeah, no, let's I'm nervous.
I'll give you a summary of what you're going to learn, because this is really
Yes.
interesting. So it is kind of weird that the Bible isn't that explicit about one husband, one wife, but
Yeah.
seems to assume it in the New Testament, where in the Old Testament, it seems to assume that wealthy men have multiple wives.
Yes,
Yes. And I thought it was really weird. I was like, it's almost like the cultural norms changed before the New Testament was written. And so I started to study the issue more. And what I learned is actually in Roman cultural norms, it was one wife. And so the area of Israel being a Roman colony at the time, it would have been culturally normative for them at that period, at least within like the power structure of society, to default to monogamous marriages. And so Jesus was, when he was preaching to people, assumed that they all knew we had already made the switch to one wife.
So it's almost as if, like, if the New Testament were written when the Macarena was the dance of the season, then everyone would be doing the Macarena in the Bible, and we would just assume that it's biblically correct to do the Macarena.
Kind of. I actually would word it a bit differently, and I'll go into this conception more in a second. But I think that you can see Christianity as a marriage of Roman culture, or the first true civilization, in terms of, from my perspective, like the descendant of modern civilization. When I look at something like Egypt, it wasn't like the real precursor to the modern states. You may have Greece or something like that, but I think that Rome is a successor state to the Greek culture. And what Christianity is that what we call the Western cultural canons, marriage with the Jewish cultural canon, to create Christianity. And I think that once you understand through the story of how it relates to monogamy that it is this marriage, then you can better understand the role in the Western tradition that pre that marriage, the Jewish branch of the system should play and the Roman/Greek branch of that system should play.
That actually really resonates, and I've never thought about that before, that in the end, there's a ton of Roman culture in both the New Testament, but also the Catholic Church in general.
Catholics, more than anyone else, have adopted the Greek/Roman side of this cultural marriage in
Wow.
their elevation of the great thinkers of Greek among their own great thinkers. I mean, they did a
Yeah.
very good job of pulling in and marrying that canon and creating something which is fairly unique to Christianity as a religious system, which is a presumptive assumption of a separation of church and state, which is to say that, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. This is what, famous Jesus line, which assumes church and state will be separate, which I think was one of Christianity's greatest strengths in terms of its growth and very unique. That's not true of Judaism. That's not true of Islam. That's not true of Confucianism. That's not true of most other religious systems. But let's get into this. Okay, so arguments for monogamy that could be made. The best argument for monogamy in the Old Testament is going to be Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And you generally see the Adam and Eve narrative is played out here. They're like, oh, Genesis. But unfortunately, if you take the interpretation we take of this line, which I think is the correct interpretation, a husband and wife do not become one flesh when they have sex. That's insane. They become one flesh when they make a baby. That is when a husband and wife become one flesh. And so if you take that assumption, there's no reason that a man couldn't also become one flesh with other women. This is not a line laying out that he should only have one wife, nor is the Adam and Eve story laying that out. And I think that in the original interpretations of both of these stories, we have that laid out as very obviously not the mainstream interpretation, given that like pretty much every powerful Jewish person in the early Bible has multiple wives. So I don't think that that's a strong interpretation. Then next here you have Jesus reaffirmed this view of marriage, stating, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. But again, I don't really see this as necessarily exclusively being monogamy if you take one flesh to mean make babies.
Well, also when you think about how things are described in a nature video, for example, like, and the male manatee will mate with the female manatee. And it doesn't imply that the manatees are monogamous. It just implies that this is how the reproductive process works.
It's not an implication of that at all.
Yeah.
Then here you have Corinthians 7:2, where Paul states, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, this is in the New Testament, I think the strongest place where it is just like really obvious there is an assumption of monogamy. However, I don't know, like to me, because these are in, the letters, right? This is more to me like, well, when you're talking to your people, we know because we're Romans that it's a monogamous relationship, right? Like that's the assumption there. And then the next line here, if you look at like Timothy 3:2 or Titus 1:6, they also seem to assume monogamy, especially among the wealthy people, which is when you see polygyny more commonly, specifically with lines where Paul states, when talking about the qualifications for church leaders, being, quote, the husband of one wife, end quote. Now, here's the interesting thing, Simone. You might have just heard that quote and thought something. In Timothy and Titus, when they're laying out what the qualifications for church leaders are, it says, I'm just wondering, what question is brought to mind for you? The qualification for having leadership within the church being, quote, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Who is that a problem for?
Priests.
Catholics.
Yeah.
It's a problem for Catholics. Do you know how they get around it? It's actually pretty interesting. I was
Sorry, she's teething and she has really sharp teeth. Wear a wedding ring and they marry Jesus, essentially. So
the way that Catholics get around this is I've read two. They go, it's meant to be taken metaphorically. That's my favorite. Where I'm like, what? What? Like you believe the craziest stuff. Like you're literally eating Christ's body and blood. And
that's not metaphorical. No.
You're like, that was probably metaphorical. But then two, they'll say, well, it doesn't explicitly demand that they must be married. It's meant to be read as they can't have more than one wife. It's saying that church leadership shouldn't be polygynous. And I guess it can technically be read that way, but that's quite a squirrely reading of this and seems not to be what's intended.
Yeah.
The husband of one wife. So what they mean is, what they say is it means not more than one wife. But even then, it's clearly saying that church leadership should, like, broadly speaking, be married. Like,
Yeah, that's I haven't it's been a while since I've read Corinthians, so I guess that's what this is from, right? Guess I missed that part. Wasn't paying attention as much as I should be. Because that's pretty striking.
yeah. Now, here's the thing with Jesus, though. If you remember the quote earlier I mentioned where Jesus says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What he's actually doing, what Jesus, and in context, when I think about Jesus, I think about Jesus as a Jewish preacher in the early days preaching to Jews. He is quoting two parts of Genesis and trying to use them to make an argument that changes. I think it is possible that he was trying to argue for monogamy there. And if he was doing it in the way a classically, like, a Jewish rabbi would have done it.
I don't know. I feel like he's Jordan Petersoning, which, he's like, get out of your family's house, get a job, make your bed, instead of specifically get married and be monogamous. When I hear that statement is you need to leave your parents' house, start your family, and become independent.
I can see what this was said in response to.
Yeah, because the context of it does make a really big difference. If he's saying this specifically with regard to the type of composition of a marriage or adult life, then I can get that maybe it's an argument for monogamy. But this sounds more to me like you got to grow up and start your family. And that could be, he's using the most common form of pairing for your average person. And of course, the average person who's not super high wealth or high status is going to not have more than one wife.
Just getting an answer here. So this is specifically about divorce, apparently.
Huh?
Yeah, he's arguing against an easy path to divorce.
Okay.
Which I can see now could be a stronger case for this being about monogamy specifically. So because this is being said in response to divorce, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? That it could be taken to also argue for monogamy, with the implication of, well, then why not just take another wife here? I don't see it as being that strong an argument for it, but I definitely see it as being an argument for it. And no, the reason why it needs to be a strong argument is because what this is evolving is the old Jewish traditions, which now let's start to talk about these, because, actually, but before I go further, there is actually another change in marriage tradition that happened during this period, is pushing away Levirate marriages, or marrying brothers' dead spouses.
Yeah, because there were a bunch of rules in the Bible. And there's a bunch of rules in the Talmud about this too, right?
Generous thing you would do historically. If you're in one of these cultures where women wouldn't have had a way to support themselves, they might have had other kids with a man. It's your genetic closest relative. It's actually almost like a perfect system. Like if my estate was going to a wife and she was still genetically fit, evolutionarily, I would want the kids that she bared to, if they can't be 50% me, because they can't be literally my kids, they can be 25% me. And then that for every two kids, it's like one kid that I had with her or more, given that, the amount of genetic similarity siblings have. That is a really easy system and a really good system. But because the culture in Rome was beginning to move away from that, you had things like Paul further developing the this teaching by reversing the Old Testament command for a man to marry his dead brother's wife. Instead, Paul said that widows can marry whomever they wanted. This is Corinthians 7:39. In the Old Testament, there is only one section that could be used to argue against polygyny, one man having many wives. Specifically, Deuteronomy 17:17, which again, this one is not great for Catholics. He should, and this is speaking of the king, right? He should not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself an excess of silver and gold. So it's
That just
saying
sounds
that
like moderation. I'm hearing too many, not many. I mean, like
too many.
a
And this
few.
becomes
Many is more than a few. I think he's just
this
saying
becomes
like
relevant when you consider the context of this, which is Solomon being punished for 700 wives. That is,
okay.
in my mind, too many wives.
Too many.
But
Well, especially when you compare it to wealth. I think this is about, again, not having too much. And many is more than a few, though of course we don't know the original.
I
This is a
know.
translation.
Hold on, I'll tell you. 700 is more than was intended by this line. 100
That's a
wives,
lot.
300 concubines. So, but
Wait,
what I
oh, whoa, wait, okay, so a total of 1,000.
1,000. Yeah, this guy wasn't even sleeping with all his wives at this
Oh,
point. Like, this
that's
is just
yeah,
wasteful.
not
This is
enough
just
days.
wasteful at this point.
Yeah.
You can't possibly have a cycle that would work for impregnation with 1,000 women. Some of these
No.
women must have grown old without you. There's only 365 days in a year.
I know you like
buddy.
marry her at 23 and then finally you consummate the marriage when she's 30 or something.
Yeah, this is I know this is ridiculous. But I'd also say here that what's really important here is the immorality of having too many wives in Deuteronomy is said to be the same type of immorality as having too much gold. Wives and gold, similar forms of immorality here. Okay. Well, no, I mean, it's just you often get people like, oh, the Bible doesn't say having lots of wealth is the bad thing, especially not like religious institutions or leadership having lots of wealth. And I'm like, it says it like everywhere it says it. But anyway, and for people who want to go to the tabernacle and be like, yeah, but the tabernacle had gold in it, you got to watch our track series, specifically track 8. We go into that a lot. Now, arguments for polygamy. All right. So several prominent Old Testament figures practice polygamy without explicit condemnation, including Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon, and potentially also Moses, but I didn't get that one confirmed. Some Old Testament laws seem to regulate rather than prohibit polygamy, such as Exodus 21:10, which states, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights, which, by the way, I love the line there. It's saying when you take your second wife, you can't sleep with your first wife less. She's gonna get a say in that, okay? And then Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17 provides inheritance rules for children of multiple wives, implying acceptance of the practice. And then Samuel's 12:8 could be interpreted as God giving David multiple wives, quote, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. There is no explicit blanket condemnation of polygamy in the Bible. Yeah, so basically nowhere in the Bible does it say polygamy, polygyny bad. And if God had really, really felt this, I think that would be there. However, we have quotes like, quote, have you allowed all the women to live? He, Moses, asked them, quote, now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So this is Moses saying, like, okay, when you're conquering a region, you've got to kill the men. You've got to kill the wives. You've got to kill the boys. But the young girls who haven't slept with a guy yet, those are for the taking. And then there are lines which give rules about taking what are essentially, what's the word that I can use for this? Mex slaves. Captured women could be taken as wives after a period of mourning, but had to be set free if the man no longer wanted them as a wife. This is Deuteronomy 21:10-14. Here is the full quote here from a different section. If a man has sex with a slave girl who is engaged to another man, but has not yet been ransomed or given freedom, there must be an investigation. But they aren't to be put to death because she wasn't free. The man must bring a compensation offering to God at the entrance of the tent meeting, a ram of compensation. The priest will perform the ritual of atonement for him before God with the ram of compensation for the sin he has committed. Then he will stand forgiven of the sin he committed. So what this implies here, just for people who aren't quite putting all this together, when you are conquering a territory in the ancient Jewish days, we may think of these people as wives, but it doesn't say like they're allowed to say no. It says, yeah, you take them, gives them a period of mourning, but after that, yeah, you take them as a wife. And it's clear here that take them as a wife is not the same kind of wife as a Jewish voluntary wife. Why do we know that? Because different rules apply to them. Specifically, the rule that they can be divorced, and that if you divorce them, you set them free. Or they can be divorced more easily, it seems here. And with this other one, it's saying, oh, if somebody else has sex with them in the meantime, I mean, don't kill them, but they should like apologize. And tomorrow, I don't know when the next episode of this series is going to go live, because I want to make it like a series of this. We're going to go into what the Bible actually says about slavery and what the real rules are around slavery in the Bible. Now, let's talk about extramarital relations in Rome, because this gets interesting. While marriage was monogamous, Roman men often engaged in other sexual relationships. Sexual activity with slaves, prostitutes, and women of lower status was socially acceptable for married men and not considered adultery under the law. Powerful men frequently had multiple sexual partners in addition to their wife, a practice sometimes called male resource polygyny. A man having a long-term unmarried female partner existed, though its prevalence and legal status in different periods is debated. So I should note here that in Rome, it wasn't like fully modern in its understanding of monogamy. It was a monogamous system where you had one real wife that produced heirs, but you would have sex with other women if you were a powerful man. In many ways, I might think that the Roman system is actually morally superior to our existing system in the West, because
In what way? And just that it's less uptight, less brittle.
It's less brittle because it's more honest.
Yeah.
As I've pointed out, when people are like, "Ooh, Christianity, we need to go back to the old ways and be monogamous," and I'm like, okay, like what do you consider like old ways monogamous Christianity? And they're like Catholicism, and I'm like, you mean like Louis the 15th? Like what was Louis the who was
Louis
the
the
big one?
14th.
Louis the
Louis the
14th.
14th.
The height of the Catholic Empire in terms of its culture, in terms of its wealth, in terms of its technology, and the most powerful man had tons of concubines.
Well, and it's still seen as a classically French thing where any married couple, there will be dalliances. Of course, you have your mistress. Of course, you're seeing someone on the side. That's still a French trope. I don't know. It's one of those awkward things because Catholicism being pervasive in the country, and this is also an issue with Louis the 14th, is the church was constantly like threatening to not give him communion, threatening of this. And in France still, there's this constant thing of, well, it's not okay to do this, but at the same time, everyone knows to do
But at the
it.
same
It's like
time,
a very
everyone does
Catholic
it.
thing.
Yeah, so it's like
Yeah.
if you can't, when you guys control like literally the this is like the height of your cultural influence on humanity, and this is still happening. Like I'm not like, okay, well, clearly the system's not working, and you as I point out, there's no such thing as a non-polygynous society. The question is just where is the slider on how wealthy and powerful a man has to be allowed multiple wives without anyone blinking an eye.
As you've all seen on the news, our country is facing a major crisis. Why? Why are rich, successful men suddenly going out and trying to have sex with lots of women? Why would a man who's famous and makes tons of money use that to try and have sex with lots of different women? And these rich celebrities have perfectly good wives at home. Why would they even think of sex with others? Damn it! I want answers!
Of course, we all know the normal, healthy male thinks only of sex occasionally and has no desire for sex with multiple partners.
Yeah, that's right, of course. Yes. Definitely true. Yes, we all know that. Go on.
But you see, I think pervasively in non-French-like societies or non-Roman style societies today, even is now just serial monogamy, where and in the end, men appear to have multiple wives, just not exactly at the same time, just one after another. So I feel like, yes, the Roman system is better. It's less brutal. It's more honest. And I think a lot of relationships would be better off if men could just sleep with people on the side when they needed to, or maybe occasionally women too. It gets kind of complicated with that, but like if we were just open about it instead of being like, no, it has to be in a marriage or one after another, or the marriage ends once the man sleeps with someone else, because that's not practical, it seems.
Yeah, well, I will say that this reading the Bible this way and understanding, I think, what is intended by the meta narrative of the evolution of monogamy was in the church as a norm. Um, that I think tells a deeper story about sort of the soul of Christianity and the true nature of Christianity that is missed if you ignore these lines or you attempt to misinterpret them to make your modern sexual mores look like they were the mores that were had at the time of various parts of the Bible being written, which hides from you, I think, a deeper and more interesting truth. So in some of our videos here, I talk about how my ancestors were savages until they were, and when I say savages, I'm talking about like the ancient Celtic people of Britain, killing children sacrificially and burying them under bridges to ensure the bridge's stability. Like savages, evidence of human sacrifice at Stonehenge, like genuinely savage, monstrous, backwards people who didn't produce anything but mud huts. And I think we as a world are going to become more mature and get better able to deal with our differences and our histories when we can admit that most of us come from traditions. One of my favorite things is, and I often mention this when I'm bringing this up, somebody's like, we can tell he's a white nationalist because he named his kids Roman names. I'm like, the Romans colonized and conquered my people. That's like saying we can tell this person's a black nationalist because they gave their kids Victorian names. It's like, what? That makes no sense. But what they are showing, which is what is true, is that I look upon Rome, the seat of civilization at the time, and Rome did not invent civilization. Modern civilization evolved out of the Greek city-states. I think that is the birthplace of civilization, which spread from there. It spread to the Romans. The Romans helped spread it around the world. The Britons then helped spread it around the world faster. And it was one of these things where it was a meme I saw once. And it was women looking towards their ancestors, and it was women looking at like of different ethnicities, looking to ancestors of their ethnicity, and then it was men looking at their cultural ancestors. It was one of those superimposed things, was men of all the different ethnicities sort of overlapped, staring back at like Caesar, and it's like it's so true. There's the famous quote like men think about Rome X many times per day or whatever, but I don't think that that's wrong. I think that Rome was one of the baton holders of civilization.
That is not just.
It's law.
Roman law.
Is there some other form of law? You wretched woman.
1,000 apologies.
And I don't think that, I don't glorify, for example, Rome over its successor states, whether that is Charlemagne or the Holy Roman Empire or the Victorian British Empire. But I will say that for a time, it definitely represented the core of civilizing force. And what Christianity represents is when Rome contacted the Jewish people. If you go to our tract 8, we go into a lot of the genuinely savage stuff that was happening in the temple, like ripping off doves' heads, then ripping them apart by their wings, sacrificing goats. Blood would have been running from it every day. When Jesus was flipping stuff over, it was the money sacrifices for buying like animal sacrifices to sacrifice at the temple. And we argue in that tract that I think that that's actually a form of Baalite worship, and this is made very clear, and it wasn't ever meant to be done within the true religion. And I think what we see here is civilization crashing into a truly divinely inspired religion, creating something that is a merger of both of them, one in the form of Christianity, but also in the form of post-Second Temple Judaism. And this is where the views get really spicy here, which is to say that like everyone when they're first colonized, the Jewish people, and this was the people who, the king would have 700 wives. This was a people who, ripped apart animals and did all these animal sacrifices. This was the people who otherwise was fairly, they may have been more civilized than my ancestors when my ancestors first contacted civilization. But Rome was doing them a favor. It was bringing them into the era of civilization. And the Jewish people resisted, and the Jewish people resisted.
You must guarantee, of course, to keep your Jews in line.
They will do as I say, or they will suffer the consequences.
Congratulations, then, Herod. You have the full backing of Rome.
And eventually, I believe that God used the Roman Empire to smash the temple for their incalcitrance, the other forms of really, I'd almost say sort of tribal polytheistic worship that
Yeah.
doesn't feel like part of like the one true religion, helped them get out of this cycle of, polygynous tribal culture and move into the civilized culture. And this is where
Just kind of by normatively rubbing off on them.
yes, because the Jews did move out of, and we'll get into a second how they moved out of polygyny as a cultural norm. That is obviously no longer a cultural norm in most forms of modern Judaism. And many Roman things are no longer cultural norms in modern Judaism. And this is one of the areas where people see our show as being like overly phileo-Semitic. That means like overly pro-Jew. And we are very pro-Jew. Like I have respect for the modern Jewish people and the ancient Jewish people. But I would say that, when I am reading literature, do I believe that time equivalent stories in the Old Testament versus ancient Greece, who was culturally more sophisticated? It was the ancient Greeks. Just like civilization was more sophisticated. And that I think what allowed for the modern Jew to become what they are in this absolute powerhouse of a cultural tradition was the sort of smashing of the old temple, which freed the Jewish people from all of these ancient polytheistic like traditions and allowed them to evolve into the modern form of Judaism. But people could be like, oh, that's so anti-Semitic to say that point there. They're like, how could you say that Judaism now is fundamentally different than what it is? And I think that people who argue that post-Second Temple Judaism isn't fundamentally a different religion from pre-Second Temple Judaism, I think that that belief is mostly driven by a theological motivation and not a practical or fact-based motivation, where I would argue that they're probably about as different from each other as Christianity is to pre-Second Temple Judaism. Maybe a degree, maybe like half as much more different. I mean, but keep in mind, like you didn't have books like the Kabbalah during that period and stuff like that. Like they added a book, we added a book, like things change, things evolve. That doesn't mean that you don't have the right to say we still have a connection to these ancient people, but I think that the structure of the religion is quite different now. But Simone, thoughts before I go further here?
No, that makes sense. But what you're saying though is that biblically speaking, there's nothing saying that polygamy is a bad thing, and it was more of a normative and the civilizational stability development where monogamy came in, which is to say that monogamy is more normative now within religious cultures, not because morally or biblically it is superior, but from a civilizational stability standpoint, it is correlated with more flourishing. That is to say, you're going to have a more stable culture if monogamy is pervasive because you have fewer free radical uncoupled men who are likely
Yeah,
to
and this
cause
is in a lot
violence
of
in
our
society.
research that we talk about is monogamous cultures generally outcompete non-monogamous cultures in a historic context. You have fewer unattached men, which cause civilizational instability because they're basically genetic free radicals that have no reason not to become terrorists or do something else crazy. And you see this, there's been a big study that correlated monogamous versus non-monogamous cultural groups that are otherwise equal. And you saw lots higher rates of lower trust in business transactions in the non-monogamous group. You saw lots of cheating in more murder. You saw more terrorism. You saw more prostitution. It's just generally not super healthy from a cultural environment. I actually think the Roman system is probably the best. But before we get to that, because then you can have, well, okay, before we get to that, I want to go here with what it actually means that this is in the Bible this way. What it
Okay.
means is if in the future, for some technological development reason I can't imagine now, we moved into a world where polygyny was the norm, that would not be outright counter-biblical as a way to live. However, the Bible, especially the New Testament, is leaning towards a stronger monogamous interpretation. And here I would note how this began to change. Several early church fathers spoke against polygyny, including Justin the Martyr, 160 AD, who rebuked Jews for allowing polygyny. Irenaeus, 180 AD, who condemned Gnostics for practicing polygyny. Tertullian, 207 AD, who explicitly forbade polygamy. And Methodius, 290 AD, who argued polygamy had ended by the time of the prophets. And then at the Council of Neocrestria in 315 AD, there is reference to a purification period for polygamists, indicating that it was considered sinful at that time. Now, you might wonder, okay, so you have some prophets here, but you don't actually have, like, at any of the Catholic councils, them outright banning polygyny.
Yeah.
Do you know why they never outright banned it, even though it became a cultural norm? Why monogamy?
I imagine it would be hard to find the specific grounds, so you would just be
No, it's because
presumptuously
it made
doing it.
converting people super hard.
Oh, because
Because
you'd have
you
to
were
give up your wife, your extra
well, no,
wives.
not give up your wives. You have to make a number of women homeless. You no longer look
Oh,
like a good guy if you are coming into a tribe somewhere and you're like, oh, well, the chief has to choose one of his 10 wives and the rest get to be homeless.
yeah.
Like, that's not a super awesome thing to do. And so the way that they would typically do it is they took this softer line interpretation and then they'd say, well, intergenerationally, like, just so you know, like, the Bible doesn't explicitly ban it, but like, it's not super cool with it. Okay.
Oh, so, like, maybe just don't do that anymore.
Yes. So now let's talk about the decline of polygyny among the Jews. In the Talmud, 4th, 5th century CE, treated monogamous marriage as the norm, though it still discussed polygamy theoretically. And here I would note that while by the time of Jesus, many Jews had come to agree with the Roman view against polygyny, it wasn't officially outlawed. And we only have one Jewish family history from this period. It was found in a cave. And we know from it that there is, on part of it, one additional wife, where one person had 2 wives. So, like, the
Wow.
only sample we have shows 2 wives. Now, what's very interesting about this incident is the wife came into the marriage with property and an estate. So she wasn't doing it for economic reasons. It might have been for love. It might have been for any number of reasons. It might have been a Levite marriage. We don't know. Okay.
Maybe she was hot for the other wife.
Whoa, getting spicy there.
I mean,
Then we have the first outright ban on polygyny for Ashkenazi Jews came around 1000 CE. Rabbi Gershman ben Yoda issued the ban Tanaka on polygyny for Ashkenazi Jews in Germany and France. This ban was initially for about 250 years and became an entrenched tradition afterwards. Reasons for the ban included reducing friction with Christian groups, preventing men from taking advantage of wives, avoiding infighting between rival wives, and concerns about properly providing for multiple wives during difficult times of exile. Isn't that so interesting that Jews ended up banning it not for legalistic, like, God reasons, but just this is causing, for kind of the same reason the Mormons did. Like, this is causing unnecessary friction with surrounding Christians.
yeah, let's just
And
not push it.
it's kind of a pain in the butt anyway.
Yeah.
Then for Sephardic Jews, polygyny was never officially banned, but became increasingly uncommon over time. It survived longest among the Yemenite Jews until their immigration to Israel in the 20th century. In 1949, the newly founded state of Israel made polygyny unlawful. Socioeconomic factors also contributed for the decline of polygyny. It was financially straining to support multiple households. Rabbis and religious leaders generally did not practice polygyny themselves. So yeah, it just basically fell out of fashion over time. So what is your wider thoughts on all of this?
That apparently it's totally biblically okay, and the only reason we don't do it now is it kind of isn't seen as socially cool, and there are some societal reasons why it's not in the best interest of any particular society or government.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, basically, if you want to do it and you can make it work, go ahead and do it. Just know you're not going to be getting any rewards socially for it in mainstream society.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I just say it's not Abrahamic, and it may be anti-Catholic, for example. Like different religious subsets have added new rules.
Mm.
You know what's funny here is the Christian group with the most explicit rules against polygyny, biblically speaking, or in their actual like theological literature, might be the Mormons because they had to ban it, and so they have an explicit ban on
Oh
it
my
in their
gosh,
liturgy,
how
whereas none
ironic.
of the other Christians do, which is really interesting.
That
So
is
yeah,
hilarious.
and as to my thoughts on it, and I've talked about this before, specifically as it's framed as polyamory. First, I don't think it ever makes sense to have a relationship where the woman can sleep with multiple partners. That's just stupid. There's no reason for it historically. There's no reason for it evolutionarily, genetically, family wise. Like no culture in history has ever done this in
No,
big
there's
success.
one in
No,
Tibet,
there's the
right?
one that was in the mountains where a wife would sometimes marry 2 brothers. That was
Yes.
for that wasn't a successful cultural group, like, it almost immediately died out. It's like a weird thing that we know about, but it's just not done because humans don't do it, whereas multiple wives is done many times. So what do I think about this in terms of, and I love so many poly people. They're like, "Oh, yeah, like, we're truly poly," and yet, like, when they're rich, I know what they always mean is this one guy and a few girls, and maybe the girls will have some extra girls on the side, but very rarely do I see additional guys in these sorts of relationships. But interestingly, I've seen people try it, and it just hasn't led to polyamory where I've seen it tried over long periods, hasn't been stable. Like, I'm not intrinsically against it, I just haven't seen it stably work, and I think that the Roman system is probably best, where you have
Side chicks, the side chick system.
yeah, you can have side chicks, but you have one wife. I think that's probably the most stable system, but I don't hate Levite marriages either. Like I
I
see
think
the
what you're missing
morality.
here, though, is that it wasn't many of the side chicks in ancient Rome were married. And I think that there are actually advantages to this, where there's kind of this black market thing going on when you have a mostly monogamous society, and yet men have mistresses and women sometimes sleep outside of their marriage. I think that in some
Well, I mean, that's going to
cases,
lead to faster evolution.
it's going to lead to faster evolution. It allows for women, for example, to sleep with more fit partners, for example, more desirable partners, and then have children with them that are raised in the end by other men who've been cucked. But, it still leads to theoretically more desirable traits being passed on to future generations.
Yeah, I mean, a society with a lot of cucking is definitely going to evolve much faster than a society with a small amount of cucking.
Yes. Well, and I was just reading some research on trait selection and sort of what we've seen actually play out through history. And it appears to be that the most common form, I'm going to butcher this, I think, is negative selection. In other words, like bad traits get removed. That's how we evolve. It's not like multiple good traits are selected. It's more that people who have, for some reason, traits that just aren't very competitive are just less likely to see those genes passed on. And in a society that's monogamous, that's only going to happen very efficiently if women are taking on side pieces as well.
Yeah, well, and I think that, I mean, you could fix this with polygenic selection. And so I think that polygenic selection, society wide could be used to prevent a dysgenic spiral. But this is actually one of the things I've talked about is we have created one of the first societies was very, very low cucking because of the really tight child support laws, which mean that like me sleeping with somebody else and risking getting them pregnant is really potentially dangerous to me. And so a lot of high value men aren't going to do that, while low value men are still going to do that at a very high rate.
Yeah.
And so, that
Well, and
creates.
I want to argue too that women in ancient Rome weren't always sleeping around to get pregnant by other men. There was, I don't know if it was a daughter or sister of Octavian, but
Mhm.
there was some letter or something where like she had signaled to someone that she knew what she was doing, that she was being careful, and she knew like to never set sail unless her ship already had cargo.
Ah!
Yeah. Spicy.
Never set sail unless my ship has cargo. That
Uh-huh.
is a great form of birth control.
Yeah.
Already being pregnant by your husband.
Yeah. So, she wasn't gonna mess up or anything, but she could still have her fun. So I do, so I'm just gonna push back a little bit on the. Now, obviously, it will piss men off immensely for women to cuck them, have kids that aren't genetically theirs, or even sleep around. But there do seem to be, I would say, genetic advantages to it in some cases for like a population on the whole, and it happens. So you just have to admit that.
Simone, I would push back on not selecting for good genes. Like, for example, I don't think that I think I'm unusually maybe intelligent or have unusually good ability to read people, which is a good gene. I don't think I have any like bad genes, and yet I had such an easy time getting people to sleep with me when I was younger, and I had many people actively pursue me. Were we in a society like Rome or something like that, would I be getting lots of people pregnant? Yeah, probably.
You had people who had boyfriends sleep with you, like you benefited from this female propensity. Like, what's your argument?
That's the exact argument I'm making, that he's saying that it only removed bad traits. It didn't increase the rate of good traits. But I'm saying that my own background shows that it does potentially increase the rate of good traits.
Okay, fair.
But me not wanting to pay child support. Now, if I had been in Rome, I probably would have had the exact opposite motivation, because, it's frankly more fun when someone can get pregnant, right? And, another guy's going to care for it. So what's the problem? I've mentioned this in another episode, but I think that men are hard-coded to find it more attractive when they are sleeping with somebody when they know another guy is going to have the kid, because as I noted on the girls, when I would sleep with another guy's girlfriend, my standards were much, much lower because I found it really hot. And I've noted that I'm not the only one. Trump has said the same thing. Trump has said that he prefers to sleep with
I don't know if that's considered the golden standard for.
Well, I'm just saying, if people like Malcolm, you can't admit to this horrible fetish, you'll never get far in Republican politics admitting to that. And I'm like, Trump did it and admitted it. So, apparently that's not true.
He broke so many glass ceilings. So many glass ceilings.
So many glass ceilings. Anyway, love you to death, Simone.
Love you too, gorgeous.
Tilt your camera down a bit and we're going to do slaves.
Oh.
If you are watching this and wondering where these clips that have to do with Rome come from, I pity you in the extreme. It is from the TV miniseries called Rome, probably one of the best shows ever put to film. I strongly recommend, if you haven't watched it, maybe because you're young and you weren't around when it came out, it is dramatically better than something like Game of Thrones. And it is educational to boot. So you really have no excuse to not try at least to the first episode and then see if you can stop watching.
How fitting that we welcome this new beginning by swearing in the youngest consul in the history of Rome, Gaius Octavian Caesar.
My father died on this floor, butchered by men he called his friends. Who will tell me that is not murder? Who will tell my legions, who love Caesar as I do, that that is not murder? Who will speak against the motion?
Pumpkin pie!
Yeah? Does it smell good?
Oh, I hear something! It smells so tasty!
Yeah?
What
does it smell like?
Look, Mommy! Mommy!
Yeah? Oh, the oven is preheated. So then we're going to have to roll out the pie crust. So you guys ready to do that next?
Yeah! Look, it's almost done.
Excellent. Shall we?
It's mixing all the ingredients together and make pumpkin pie.
All right. And did you put them all together? Did you dump them in? What did we put in?
We put in ingredients.
Did we also put in pumpkin?
Yeah.
Did we put in cloves?
Yeah.
And nutmeg?
Yeah.
And cinnamon?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Oh, you're ready.